So I'm not seeing the participants. Let me change my view.
No, I haven't let them in yet, and you won't
Okay.
ever see them.
Oh, okay. It's that type of webinar. Okay.
All right. So we are live.
So I'm not seeing the participants.
And we can get started whenever you're ready.
Hello, folks. My name is Sean Smith. We'll get started here in just a moment. I'll allow folks to kind of enter in and get situated. We're expecting a few more folks. So hope it's sunny and almost 70 here in these parts in the Lawrence, Kansas area. Rachel, what's it down in Florida? 102? No, it's probably beautiful.
High 80s.
High 80s, of course.
High 80s, beautiful.
Feel free in the chat if anyone wants to say, if you have access to say hello, although it doesn't, I don't know how we have things set up. If you have access to the chat to say hello, feel free to say hello. And we'll get started in it's about 1 o'clock. We'll wait till about 1:01, 1:02. As I wait for my webinars that I tend to host, I generally have Frank Sinatra on the background. I should have gotten him queued up, but there you go. We have folks saying hello hello, Ashley from Orlando. Sounds like you're in the 80s there. I'm learning a lot more about Orlando and the various covenances and the governmental structures from national news. Hi, Tammy from Pennsylvania. All right, about another minute, we'll get things rolling. All right, I say about another minute, but it's 1:02. So I think we're gonna get things rolling. So I'll get started again. And my name is Sean Smith, co-principal investigator on the CITL project. Welcome, everyone. We have a great hour planned for you. We'll get into that in just a moment. But before any further, let's kind of have everyone introduce themselves that will be kind of helping to facilitate this. And I'm at the University of Kansas. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Special Education. So Keon, you want to take it from there?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Keon Alavi, and I am a technical assistant specialist with the Cedar Center, and we'll talk a little bit about what the Cedar Center is.
Rachel or Samantha? Samantha?
I'm Samantha Goldman. I am a doc student at KU.
My name's Rachel Silva, and I am a graduate student as well, PhD, first year, and I am a graduate assistant at the Cedar Center.
Maya Israel will not be with us. She's a faculty member from the University of Florida, and Maya is en route from ARA. And Samantha and Rachel, both graduate fellows, doctoral fellows, awesome, so much more than graduate students in their work with Cedar and CITL. And Keon is so much more than what he just described himself as. He does lots of different things for Cedar and so much more than that. But I'll let them just be humble, and I'll let, I think, Keon and Rachel kind of take it from there in terms of getting us started about this affinity group and this relationship and all that. So.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk a lot about the CITL and Cedar co-affinity group. But before we go into that, I just wanted to start out by giving some background about the Cedar Center. So the Cedar Center, and bear with me for this, and it's a little bit hard to remember sometimes, but it's the Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform Center. I know it's a mouthful. And like CITL, we are an OSEP-funded technical assistance center, and which is the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Ed. We partner with about 25 states. You can see on our map here some of the states that we partner with to kind of provide technical assistance that really focuses on the capacity of personnel preparation in those states. So it's those systems of personnel preparation in many different regards, including preparing personnel to serve in the, those settings that we weren't talking about 5 years ago, like CITL focuses on, and especially in this affinity group focus on those hybrid and online learning environments. Within CEDAR, we have a lot of different approaches to our technical assistance, which includes state teams, state work. But one thing that we do as well is that we look at how can we build collaboration and learning between states. And that's where we have the ideas of an affinity group, or is really a group that we bring together our different participating CEDAR states. And sometimes like our current affinity group, like this one we're speaking about, we also open it to other states who are not necessarily partnering with CEDAR at the time. And I'll kind of turn it over to Rachel to really go into exactly what an affinity group means.
Thanks, Keon. And so an affinity group is really a collaborative learning opportunity where we respond to a common need across the field. It's typically focused on a particular topic, but really, again, what Keon said, it focuses on collaboration and cross-state dialogue. And so we really want participants to be able to learn from one another, to hear examples from around the country, and to be able to think about how those examples could apply within their context. Our particular topic was around preparing teacher candidates for online and hybrid instruction. This is where CEDAR partnered with CITL to be able to really look at this particular topic of thinking about preparing teachers, but specifically for the online and hybrid context.
Rachel, the key stakeholders for your affinity groups, I know vary, but could you talk about that as well?
Yeah, and so our key stakeholders can differ. And so like Keon said, it could be our state partners, but with this particular affinity group, we were really looking to be a resource for educator preparation programs to really think about how their coursework, how their practicum experiences are really preparing teachers for that online and hybrid instruction. And so this affinity group is not a traditional webinar. And so we have a lot of opportunities for engagement. And so some of our engagement strategies, we use Jamboard, we use Padlet, and then breakout discussions as well to first start brainstorming about a particular topic. So for example, what types of terminology are used to describe clinical experiences, practicum experiences. Then we would often go to a speaker and hear from their perspective, and then have an opportunity for stakeholders, members of those IHEs and EPPs to communicate about what they thought about the presenters. And so the success of the affinity group is really contingent on this active participation discussion, thinking about how our speakers and our resources can apply to different contexts, and also providing feedback back to the affinity group on how we can provide resources and what other topics we need to explore within this learning opportunity. Again, our motto is listen and share.
So one question that might always think is like, you're doing this affinity group, like what happens with it? Are you just meeting? Are you actually trying to accomplish something? Is it culminating in the creation of a product or anything like that? And so really what these affinity groups aim to do, like we said before, is really to facilitate that learning, to really bring stakeholders together. And that's our primary goal. And we do have some kind of outputs of our different affinity groups, including just whether it be a meeting recording or whether it be kind of resources that were shared and highlighted, all of these different things have been done for not just this Affinity group, we're talking about other ones we've done in the past. We've done ones before on licensure and shortages, literacy and dyslexia, math, strategic communications, and opportunities for faculty to kind of integrate that's the work they're doing with CEDAR into their scholarship. And so all of these live now on the CEDAR website through what we call professional development packs, which including this Affinity group that we're going to be speaking about today as well, are available through these packs. And I will put the link in the chat in just a second, but I just want to let everybody know that this is where kind of that output that you can see from not just this Affinity group, but other Affinity groups as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sharing that. So we're going to talk today about our Affinity group, which focused on how we are preparing pre-service teachers for the online and hybrid environments. We had 6 Affinity group meetings and each one focused on a different topic. So we're going to kind of give an overview right now of the different topics that we discussed. So at the first meeting, we really focused on this question of why are we still talking about online learning? We're back in schools. Why is this still a thing? Online learning existed before the pandemic. It allows for personalized competency-based learning. It allows for flexible ways to engage in the learning. And online programs are data-driven and they have regular progress monitoring built in. So the idea of online learning did not come because of the pandemic. It wasn't an emergency response. It was actually around a lot longer than that. Sorry, my computer's taking a second to switch sides. Come on. So after school closures, there was this concern with FAPE, and we talked about that in one of our meetings. We talked about the concerns of how students' accommodations and modifications and specially designed instruction were being met, and how students were being kind of mixed matched with services. One thing that came about was that the concern was not just from parents, but it was from educators and related service providers as well. And our teachers didn't feel prepared for this environment. And that was based off of research that our colleagues at Mary Washington, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, had completed. Another thing that we talked a lot about was supports for students with disabilities. So how does that differ in the online environment versus in the classroom? And so you're looking at different digital tools to support that understanding. You're looking at how you're having small groups or conferences with students in this virtual environment, what accommodations you might need in the virtual environment that are different than in the classroom, things like closed captioning on movies or videos that you're sharing, limiting the screen time, right? We don't want kids sitting in front of the screens all day long. So being creative with how we're using that time. And then what happens, we had a guest speaker come in that teaches high school in the virtual environment. And she actually said that eligibility determination is still happening in high school in the virtual classroom, which is very different than the online classroom. We'll hear a little more from Marsha Riggins in a little while, but she shared something that really struck me, was that students with more complex needs are not only thriving in the online classroom, but they're interacting and establishing relationships with neurotypical peers. So we might think of online learning as this emergency response, and that in-person is best for everybody. But what we discovered through this process and through this affinity group, things that we've talked about, is that some students, in some situations, online learning really is the best environment for them. And it opened up the doors for that. So we talked at our second meeting, we had our colleagues from Mary Washington, Dr. Kevin Good, Dr. Melissa Jenkins, and Dr. Jennifer Walker come and discuss their work. They completed a paper on practices in special education, what stakeholder perceptions and implications for teacher preparation. And they focused on 2 research questions. The first one was, how did stakeholders perceive their efficacy? And the other one was, how did stakeholders perceive the legal aspects of school closures? And the general findings from them were that though the components of FAPE might have been there, it was less effective with the specialized instruction. So basically our teachers weren't prepared for the environment. We also focused on 3 types of standards: the national standards for quality online learning, high leverage practices, and the ISTE standards, which Dr. Smith is going to talk more about. Teaching methods and curriculum. We actually had 2 sessions dedicated to this, which focused on providing resources that can be taken back from the Affinity group into the teacher prep classroom and then into the classroom, the teacher classroom, the teacher pre-service teacher and service teacher classroom. So we gave a bunch of tools, and these are just a few of them, focusing on engagement, things like Jamboard, Pear Deck, and Nearpod, which Keon alluded to. We talked about programs that you can use for literacy, like Bookshare, which is audiobooks, News ELA, which provides leveled reading comprehension and questions to go along with it, and then predictive text and text-to-speech programs through Johnston, so that's Snap and Read and Co-Writer. We also talked about Project Voice and the Social Express for social emotional development. And there's more tools that we had talked about that are now available on the CITL blog. You should check that out. There's a lot of really great resources there that you can take back. And then we had a lot of resources for assessment, ways to get formative assessment from your students to take back with them in more creative ways than just a paper and pencil kind of a quiz. We had Dr. Marty Elford come and talk to us about virtual practicum, and she focuses her research on coaching pre-service teachers in virtual learning environments. And she asked a lot of really good questions, or we posed a lot of very good questions in that meeting. More questions than answers, but looking at what experience do teachers need with online and hybrid learning? Does every teacher need that experience? And who determines which teachers do and don't need virtual practicum? How is that supervision done? Is it live? Are they sitting next to the pre-service teacher while they're virtually teaching? Is it in person? Are they on Zoom or whatever platform with the teacher? Are they watching a recording? And then what standards are being used as mastery indicators? And the biggest takeaway from that session was there needs to be an increased professional learning for faculty and university supervisors so that it's creating a clear and universal expectation for these online practicums, and also a sense of what's involved in online teaching, because it's not simply taking your classroom into the computer world. There's so much more that goes into it, and that needs to be taken into account when we're looking into that virtual practicum. We also talked about in that session, the difference between a learning coach and an online teacher. Students in virtual programs have both of them, and the learning coach is typically a family member. Maintaining and creating boundaries when you're teaching pre-service teachers about teaching online, things like making sure that they understand that they have working hours, how to turn off their notifications so that they're not feeling like they need to be responding to emails 24/7, teaching them about Google Voice numbers so that they can communicate with their families without giving out their personal number to remain in those boundaries. And then also providing opportunities to work with families with practice. So observations of it happening, scenario-based learning, providing feedback for them so they're not just being thrown into the field and never having had that experience. We had Jill Raffick come and discuss with us how to support families. She's a parent and an advocate for students with disabilities, and she shared her perspective of virtual and online learning. She shared a couple really important things. So the positive outcomes from online learning was that just because you're not able to physically attend school doesn't remove a student from the learning environment. So for example, if a student is sick but functioning, so like ill for whatever reason, or having surgery or whatever it might be, that they're not able to physically be in school, they can still attend to the learning. And for some students, like we talked about earlier, they're more engaged and have more benefit from doing the therapies at home and virtual setting. And it also builds a really great working relationship with parents and teachers. She cautioned us to make sure a couple of things. One, make sure that parents have the materials that they need for the lesson at home and ready to use, right? It's not effective if they need a ruler and they don't have one, or the ruler is in a different room. It breaks that stamina that you've got going. Also, not all families are going to be able to advocate for and support their students in the same ways. And then she asked an important question, which is, why is that parent perspective, or a question came up. Why is that parent perspective left out of educator prep programs? And how do we bring that perspective in so that we're able to engage with parents in an effective and meaningful way?
So we had, and I'm gonna now share my screen if that's okay. And so we'll do a bit of a transition, but we had this affinity group, as Kian and Rachel explained, and hope everyone can see that here. And I can't talk and chew gum at the same time, so I'm gonna go ahead. Here we go. So we had the affinity group that basically allowed, over the course of 6 months, to really get into these issues. And so today's webinar has two purposes. Is one, as we've already kind of described, elements of what we covered over those 6 months. And in so doing, as Kian shared, we have links to a number of these, actually all these presentations, as well as a variety of other resources that Samantha will reinforce here towards the end as well, that came out that are sitting on CITL, but also on CEDAR. And of course, we didn't introduce CITL, since this is a CITL webinar. We figured folks are familiar with the overall focus, but as Kian indicated, our focus is a little more targeted, and Rachel indicated, our focus is on individuals in personal preparation programs looking to infuse educational technology. And so, of course, one of the areas has been online learning. So this is one of the topics. Now, we had a number of guest speakers, as we mentioned, and we wanted to bring Marcia back, and Marcia was willing, and she's an elementary school teacher. She's taught face-to-face. She's teaching entirely fully online right now. She was doing that prior to the pandemic. She's continued to do that through the pandemic. Phenomenal teachers, won a series of awards. Sadly, she was not able to be with us live due to last minute things, but we have part of her recording, and you'll hear Kian ask a few questions as we go along as well. And we wanted to kind of target some areas, and the primary area is for us, and not exactly sure who's all attending, but definitely as part of the affinity groups, as Rachel mentioned, stakeholders that are aligned with this further development of educators. And so why would we need to focus more on online, remote, distance learning? The pandemic, I mean, Dr. Fauci just said, I think, we're out of the pandemic. So wait, online learning's gone. But as Samantha emphasized at the beginning, online learning certainly predates the pandemic. It continues to go online. My goodness, our school district of about 12,000 students, about 1,500 students are fully online. And so anyways, that is a reality. So let's listen to Marcia just a bit, talk about some of the needs, some of the differences, and therefore the impact on developing future educators for having those skills if they're going to be successful in this fully online K through 12 teaching experience. So here we go.
Elementary, it is a little bit different than it is at the high school. So as an elementary, and this year being one grade level, has made a different impact than in the past. So previously trying to do 3 grade levels and 3 sets of standards and meeting at 3 different levels, it was more of a challenge. So now with 1 grade level, we meet with our kiddos. We have a flexible class schedule, whether they either come in the morning or the afternoon. So I see the kids 4 days a week routinely as a group. Right now I have 18 students, and so we split them so that each class is about 9 kiddos so that they can actually be interactive. So they have cameras on, and we try to make it, yes, standards based. We have math class, we have language arts class, but also again, building that relationship. And I think the biggest piece for the kiddos when they're the elementary age is the comfortability with making mistakes in a group and knowing that everyone does it and that's how we learn. And so a lot of the things that I do are those classes. I also have conferences, but in the elementary, when we're still looking at trying to figure out intervention wise, is it a learning struggle? Is it they don't have it yet? Or is it an area where we're looking more at a SPED and trying to tease out all the different pieces? So we do conferences, we do small groups, and then if it is the small groups and they're still not necessarily grasping what we need or at the rate in which we need, then we also have the intervention piece. So, and it does look, I have a general plan. I do what my class is going to look like, but just like, it's very similar in the classroom as when you go in, you think you have your lesson plans for the day, and it never quite shakes out like you thought it was going to. It can be kind of close, or it can be a completely different day from what you had planned. So there is, that piece is similar as far as being in the classroom. You just never know what you're going to have, even though you have it planned. But and I would echo exactly what Lauren said. We spend a lot of time, especially at the elementary, getting to know not only the kiddo, building that relationship, but also we work very closely. They have a learning coach, which is the adult at home with them. And so building the relationship with them so that we can have those trusting conversations and be a little bit more of a stronger team as we work for that kiddo.
I should clarify, she's referring to another colleague, Lauren, who's a high school online teacher who will be visiting us. And this was pre-recorded back in our November affinity group when we introduced this issue. So let me continue.
Elementary, it is a little bit different than it is at the high school. So as an elementary, and this year being one grade level, has made a different impact than in the past. Classroom, as when you go in, you think you have your lesson plans for the day, and it never quite shakes out like you thought it was going to. It can be kind of close, or it can be a completely different
Sorry, a bit of an overlap when I press play again.
planned. So there is, that piece is similar as far as being in the classroom. You just never know what you're going to have, even though you have it planned. But and I would echo exactly what Lauren said. We spend a lot of time, especially at the elementary.
I'll move
getting
that forward to
know
our next question. Here we go.
Thanks, Marcia. One thing that you said that is really resonating was talking about looking at the learning differences of the students. You know, are they almost there? Is there a need for an intervention? And what that looks like in a virtual teaching context. Lauren, how is your experience, you know, navigating students' learning differences, and what does that look like in your classroom?
That's a great question, because that's probably one of the most challenging, is just to make sure that you are thinking about all the different facets that are of the students that are coming into your classroom. We, like, for example, an Algebra 2 class this year only has 60 students in it, but that could be 60 students in the same live session all at once. And so you have to think about the, you know, just like in a brick and mortar classroom, the multiple ways to present to those students. But some of the other things we run into with like the virtual environment are, you know, I have a student who lost her hearing over the summer. So we had to make sure we had transcripts and live captions, but we also had to make sure that they were accurate, and then being able to edit afterwards and things like that. We have some students that have migraine headaches and have been in serious injuries, accidents, and have to adjust their screen time. So trying to figure out, if your main purpose is to be in a session like this, hosting a class, how to take the information you want to teach your students and provide other alternate ways. Not only for their traditional learning differences and learning styles, but also for things that come up that it kind of throws it out there at you, which I know you would experience in a brick and mortar, but I feel like I've experienced it so much more and having to dig deeper and find other resources. At the high school, we do have all of our students, we'll have our students identified with our 504s and our IEPs and any accommodations we need to make. And we typically have a weekly meeting for intervention as well, so that we can say, okay, you know, this student's on our radar. We need to try to these other general education interventions, but it's going beyond that. And one of the unfortunate things about our high school at times, and not necessarily from our elementary teacher and middle teachers on up, but we have a lot of families that join us at the high school level that have homeschooled the entire time, K through 8. And because they homeschooled the entire time, they may not have been identified. And so as a high school teacher, my first experience is starting an IEP and actually like having to get students to be screened for services and things. I had never done that as a brick and mortar teacher. It had already been figured out at earlier grades. And so just based on the way our school is set up, we do have that, a lot of the homeschool students coming in that we're having to experience that may not have had special services before, and trying to navigate that too.
Marcia and Lauren, just a quick question. Sorry to interrupt there, Cam, but prior to the pandemic, we saw that a good number of individuals with disabilities, parents would select the online environment for a variety of different reasons. And Lauren, you mentioned the migraines and other type of health considerations. Is that something that continues, that you're seeing, where maybe you even have a larger percentage of individuals with some learning differences in that fully online environment because of the nature of that?
So definitely, I would say definitely. And before I had some that had with the special ed, either they came with an IEP or that we identified. This year and starting last year, but really more this year, I've received more kids with the DLMs and they're engaging in class, and the way that they engage with class is different. But I guess the best piece was just to see the power and the gift that they bring to the class. So the fact that we can include them and they can be
Dynamic learning maps are individuals with more extensive needs, so DLMs. Oh, shoot, and I'm messing up by trying to offer narrative, and I'm gonna have to fast forward here. Here we go.
elementary, it is a little bit different, exactly what Lauren's.
My apologies, folks. Here we
Parents
go.
get
At the same level, no, but like in our morning meetings to hear them, the different activities that they can do with using they greet, the one little boy, he greets the kids, and to see their classmates engage with them. And that idea of, because that really up until the pandemic, it was so limited and our model was slightly different as far as class-wise, Sean. Some of those kiddos did not get to experience I would say the gifts that some of the special education students bring and to how to interact with them. And so yes, they've come to us in different numbers, but I think it's also brought a different experience and an added experience for the kiddos who were here prior to the pandemic and that who had been traditionally homeschooled, had not ever had to really engage and understand and even process what it was like to engage with classmates that learned different than them. So that's been a huge bonus for our grade this year.
And I think to add to that, the other thing we've seen too is that there's been a huge uptick in students that, maybe chronic lung situations, students that are now immune compromised from cancer treatments, things of that nature, who never really planned on doing online, but the pandemic forced them into it. But then beyond that, whenever their situation, if it resolves or otherwise, they may have found that it truly works best for them. I know that I can speak from my personal experience. My son last year did virtual kindergarten. And he received a diagnosis this year of being on the autism spectrum. He is the level 1, so towards the higher end, more of where Asperger's may have been, but he's also gifted. And so he was really struggling with the preschool model of where he was at and where his learning was at and how it was different. And so some of the things that we could offer within the virtual environment was he started doing small group with first grade. And being in a virtual environment allowed him to focus on the learning and the education versus all the distractions that were going around the room with him. So there's been a lot of students who came here by, almost by accident because COVID happened. And they're like, this is what is best for me. I'm not getting bullied. I'm not having, issues. We've had a lot of students with eating disorders and things that I hadn't thought about bringing them to us, but they're not having to worry about those appearances and things as well.
So I'm going to move this along just for the last segment, that they really reinforce the fact that, okay, so what does this mean for us as future teacher educators in respect to this online environment?
You want to coin toss, Lauren, to see who gets to go first? I would say that the skills that you need to be an online or virtual educator, while similar, are also so different. The communication that you have to be able to have with a parent, and it has to be there are some very difficult conversations because of the fact that they're home. And generally it is the parent that is the home educator for especially the elementary. And they look at those kiddos with the love that they have for them. And so sometimes having to share the difficulties that you see, whether it be learning, behavior, helping them set routines, because in the classroom I had 100% control and now I have very little. And so sometimes setting up those barriers and what it would look like. So there is so much more coaching and counseling of parents and learning coaches than I ever did in the brick and mortar. And then the other piece would be, yes, I teach the standards, math, language, yes. But the kiddos who are remote or virtual or distance, whatever term you want to use, they also need the general experiences that the kids in the classroom get. And so this year, having been 2 years now almost removed from the classroom, my third graders left March of first grade. And so they lost a lot of experiences as a first grader, that as a third grader, just trying to make sure that they didn't lose them, and to engage with We sing in class, which is not a strength, Sean will tell you. I draw, I try to lead them in drawing, but really thinking more of not just honing in on only those standards, and explaining that to the parents. Some of our parents are very driven and they do, math, language, art, yet we're going to, but realistically it's a journey, not a race. And we have to make sure that they get there and they still love learning once they leave. So anything that you can do. And then the best thing is if you can be a performer. I would say sometimes I feel like I'm more of a performer than a teacher, because you do have to be engaging and you have to be willing to be silly, and especially at the elementary. And then, so that would be mine.
Thanks, Marcia. Lauren, we'll turn it over to you.
I would say too, my background's a little different. I did an alternate certificate, and so I didn't have the teacher preparation program outside of a few of the classes. I decided my last semester to jump in the teaching bandwagon of things. But what I can say is that the experiences I had for my 5 years in brick and mortar, while they are directly connected to a lot of things I teach content-wise, there's so much more, like Marcia was saying, being a counselor and stuff, even to the parents. What I have found is that in order to really connect with the students and make sure that they're learning, there are some, they don't need you. They can come into class and just take it and go. Like they really can do that. But there are so many that when they do come to the online environment, have never dealt with isolation and being at home and coming up with their own schedules. So I feel like by the time our students leave, I feel like, especially from having been in the high school and having to set their own schedules and work on that discipline, being able to go to a college environment and say, oh, I only have 2 hours to study, I need to do that. And so there's a lot more of those executive functioning skills, counseling the students and the families of how to help a high schooler navigate, they have extra freedom, how to help them, be disciplined, and, and students coming to you for all sorts of things that they don't have another person to go to sometimes, even though we have counselors and connecting. So there's so much more of the social emotional that you can't just stand up like you're standing on a whiteboard and writing on a whiteboard in front of a class. It goes so much more beyond the content. You really have to have those relationships as a key buy-in.
So there was a lot going on with that.
It is a little bit different.
Sorry, my mouse clicking. There was a lot going on in respect to that session. And so you just had snippets, and you can see with those snippets, a lot of great information that really illustrated to us that, yes, what goes on in that online hybrid remote type of classroom requires a variety of different skills. And so we wanted to emphasize that. And so for the rest of this webinar today, we wanted to kind of illustrate some of those things, some things that we reinforced in the affinity groups over the last 6 months, and also some things that hopefully are very practical for folks as we are all trying to do this at different degrees within our efforts at personal preparation. So to begin with, I want to emphasize something that Samantha shared, and we'll get this link out to you in respect to this presentation. And many of these are hyperlinked as well in terms of some of these resources, one being the national standards for quality online courses. And so with that, and I'll link here real quick to let you know, these have been created by a variety of stakeholders. And in so doing, they've emphasized standards affiliated with online teaching, online programs, online courses. And in so doing, they've tried to offer some guidance. And this was our session in December when we had colleagues from the University of Mary Washington, as Samantha shared, kind of talk about that alignment with what we're doing with our CC standards, our NTEST standards, or other standards that are dictating our coursework, our structure, things of that nature. What guidance do we have? We are standards-based. Where can we go for a better understanding? Yes, ISTE, but these even more so. So there are some standards out there that give us a little bit more direction in what we could and should be doing in terms of this experiences when it comes to our undergraduate or graduate level personal preparation. Now, with that said, there are certain issues that really stand out, and you heard both Lauren and Marcia mention these, things like executive function skills that, yes, of course, we cover, but even more so because of the demands of the online environment. Engagement, they both said that multiple times. My goodness, Lauren was 60 students in a class online. What she's requiring to do in order to facilitate that engagement. Marcia, of course, had a little bit smaller, but remember, Marcia also mentioned the fact that her class of 18, she's working with half the time because she split them up So therefore, half their academic week is not online with Marcia. So how do you engage them? And of course, she also talked about that engagement with the learning coach, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. And then, of course, assessment. They both alluded to that, and that area has been a primary area of concern, not only during the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, and ongoing in terms of at a distance. What does that mean? What types of tools do I use? But also, what does that mean as I try to facilitate it? And so a lot of different issues going on, particularly with students with disabilities, when we try to teach in this environment, therefore, skills we need to develop with future educators because of those components. Now, some of you, as you're listening, you may say, well, Sean, yeah, you have the NASR standards, but I've been doing technology integration for years, and I'm familiar with the TPAC model, and isn't some of that in relationship to what I need to integrate and how I need to prepare my future educators for these types of environments? And yes, part of it is back to the future. Part of it is the fact that, yes, this is, we have some guidance, we have some areas to further illustrate, to further integrate, to further guide us, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for example, with that in mind, language and literacy, and we've been doing this for years, but very meaningfully integrating in tools like text-to-speech. But text-to-speech goes so much beyond that, but integrating elements of digital text and what that means. Because of course, if I'm online, that text is most likely digital. If it's digital, what tools do I use? How do I use them? What's the purpose of using those tools? And of course, where do I integrate that in? I integrate that into language and literacy development in my coursework, my methods coursework. And of course, some of these tools are critical. So for example, Newsella actually levels the text. So all of a sudden, instead of a traditional print book that can't change text on the fly, Newsella does. A traditional print book can't read the text out loud, can't highlight the text, can't use highlighters to actually group text, can't use Cornell notes that are embedded in things like Snap and Read. So these are tools that need to be integrated in for the instructor to better understand, for them to then apply. And it's just not technology for technology's sake, but with the TPAC and other models, it's technology to integrate in a purposeful manner like language and literacy. In addition, on the writing element of it, yes, there's tools like Grammarly that help with my grammar, et cetera, but there's also tools like speech to text, which will help me with fluency, will help me potentially with the amount of what I write, word production. It might help me in terms of the quantity I write. It might help me in terms of spelling. It might give me a different delivery system because of my limitations with fine motor, or that teacher that says if they could just speak what they know, that speech to text now has become so much more intelligent. So where does that fit? Or word prediction. We all use word prediction with our phones, sometimes to our detriment. Oh gosh, that's not what I meant, and that's what went out. But word prediction, in terms of not only does it help with word production and fluency, but spelling. It enhances vocabulary. They have vocabulary banks in word prediction tools like CoWriter. These are all embedded in our Chrome browser or our Safari browser. They're there for us to use. But how do we utilize them? And how do we integrate them into evidence-based practices that deal with writing? For example, the SRSD, the process. So these are all relevant things to think about as we're preparing future teachers, as well as working with current teachers. Now, both Lauren and Marcia mentioned that social emotional learning, and we know social emotional during the pandemic has taken on a significant toll, anxiety and other things, and this is not going away. We've returned back, and so how do we more personalize, individualize that, maybe for that hybrid learner, and maybe for that learner that is learning at a distance. As Marcia indicated, and Lauren did as well, they've been bullied face-to-face. They've had challenges face-to-face. Now they go online. Sure, they're removed from that, but they still need to develop those skills. They still need to develop knowledge and understanding. So how do we facilitate that online? Wow, that's tricky. So increasingly, we need to look to tools, but also not only tools, but also things to personalize and individualize. Teaching teachers to use that data to then make database decision-making, to do data walks. We'll get to that, in a variety of other things. And there's a number of tools out there. Voice is a virtual reality tool. I mention it because the University of Kansas is behind elements of developing it. Video modeling, of course, has been an evidence-based practice for years, but how do we incorporate that more when we're remote to facilitate that? And we'll get to the learning coach and how they can to facilitate that and things of that nature. So these are all elements that have been out there for a while, yet not only with the TPAC, but also within our idea of blended or personalized learning. And that is, how do we get student ownership? How do we collect the data and then use targeted instruction based on the database decision-making? How do we keep it flexible and allow options for the individual? Yes, elements of the Universal Design for Learning framework. So all these things are there, but they need to be very purposeful and explicit when we are preparing our future educators. It's just not simply a list of technology. It's just not enhancing their technology use, but it's altering their instruction and the way they facilitate that with these tools. So with that in mind, let's give you an example of formative assessment. So formative assessment was a key area of issue. So formative assessment has been out there for years. We use it in a variety of different ways, exit slips, things of that nature, exit interviews, things of that nature. But increasingly with online, my goodness, we have so many tools that are online. We have a whole host of progress monitoring tools that many of us have been using for years when it comes to our tier-based instruction. But many of these are digital, if not all of them are digital-based, Ames Web, we have the Dibble program, et cetera. And they offer us lots of different opportunities, but increasingly our content management systems, be it IXL or things of that nature, or our learning management systems, thought I had a slide there, Google Classroom, et cetera, they offer us tools to create formative assessments, or they have formative assessments. They have dashboards that share that data to then make decisions based on that data. Very different than potentially things in the past, and tools now that are really altering the effectiveness and efficiency of what we can do. So with that in mind, of course, we can quickly see trend lines. We can quickly create things in Google Forms and things of that nature that quickly allow us to not only create an automatic quiz that automatically scores and automatically places it into a dashboard, but allows us to tweak in terms of items. It allows a number of different options. And there's a host of tools out there. My goodness. Now, yes, I'm kind of going opposite what I said. We're just not looking at lists of tools, but there are a number of different resources out there in terms of facilitating formative assessment at a distance. But it's just not the tool. It's really altering the way we look upon this. But here are some, not only some, there's a variety. There's 75 digital tools and apps for online formative assessment. But these are things that not only do we need to incorporate, but we need to facilitate with a variety of stakeholders, including the learning coach. But both Marcia and Lauren mentioned that, and that is an area that, yes, as special educators, we have focused in on preparing our future educators to work with others. Now, I think of the collaboration class, and I think of the standard we're dealing with, and I think of the high leverage practice aspect of collaboration. But if you take a look at that, what is it? High leverage practices has 3 or 4 components for collaboration. Only one of them is families. The rest are professionals. You look at Marilyn Friend and Lynn Cook's book that many of us use in our collaboration class. It's very much on the professional, not so much on the parent, the adult in the home. In many instances, it's not the parent, it's the adult in the home. It could be grandma, it could be an aunt. So how do we facilitate and interact with that learning coach? Now, Marcia and Lauren both mentioned them as learning coaches, and that's the vernacular used in the online classroom. We have expectations that they're going to facilitate executive function. We have expectations they're going to engage their child. Marcia, my goodness, half the time, there's children are not with her live or synchronous. They're with some adult in the home, facilitating the rest of the instruction that she has tried to organize. So therefore, with that learning coach, we need to empower the parent, as they mentioned. We need to be able to engage them. We need to be able to support and reinforce them. Skills that we generally don't teach in teacher education today, maybe from the birth to 5 area, but not necessarily the K to 12. And yet it's a role and it's a high expectation, definitely at the elementary, if not the middle, maybe not as much as the high school, and yet think about the student with a disability we're trying to facilitate. And why do we want to communicate with them? Oh my gosh, Marcia and Lauren mentioned a number of things, but everything from supporting them to directing them to facilitating what they do, to empower them, to engage them, to allow for them to empower and engage their own learner, their child, to share information. So often what we have brick and mortar is we as the educator, we share, and the recipient is the adult in the home. They come to meetings 3 times a year, we share again. This is a 2-way conversation, and even more so by the parent. And it's very different from what we have trained our educators to do. And of course, we want to be able to facilitate everything from expectations to tips and strategies for what to potentially do at the home environment, to how to facilitate social emotional learning and practice. It goes on and on and on. But let's talk specifically about the IEP, because many of us are still doing the IEP remotely. And it's not the same, it's not your grandmother's IEP. It's not my IEP. I have a son with Down syndrome who's now of college age. The IEP process now, when it deals with remote, there's a lot of different things to think about. Not only the platform, but how do we use our LMS to facilitate the preparation for the IEP, what happens in the IEP and post-IEP. So a lot of advantages there that really enhances our communication process. Now, when we actually have the IP, what are we going to use in terms of web conferencing? And how are we going to use a variety of tools? We can potentially save ourselves tremendous amounts of times with calendars and sharing out digital agendas and using confidential elements when we're actually having that meeting. Therefore, maximizing Zoom or WebEx or whatever we're going to utilize. Now, OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs, who's funded both the Cedar Center as well as CITL, put together with a number of stakeholders virtual IEP tips for participants. And honestly, they're just not tips for virtual IEPs, they're tips for good, effective IEPs, which to me really alters that process and experience, which again requires us to do more with the educator when we're working with them. I could go on and on and on in terms of a variety of things, but that's just a tip of the iceberg of some of the things we talked about, altering what we do in our methods and assessment classes with technology infusion, but with the technology infusion, like the assessment, that facilitates a whole nother change in the process. Now, all of a sudden we have the data to how we facilitate data walks, that whole communication aspect with the learning coach. And now we're bringing someone in that hasn't been a core component of what we do instructionally for years. And now how do we utilize them? And of course, in that process, there's so much more, including like the IEP process. So with that said, I'm going to move this back over to Samantha. She's going to talk a little bit more about the CITL community and how we facilitate some of these conversations and share more than just a seminar, including some of the outgrowth from our affinity group. So go ahead, Samantha. I'll keep sharing my screen if that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah. So after the affinity groups and as things arise in the world of teacher preparation and technology, CITL has a community where we house conversations and questions and resources that just support and further the development of the faculty that are preparing these pre-service teachers. So there's a QR code to link to our community, and we'd love to have you join our conversation. And that's also where you'll find the resources for today as well. So in addition to this presentation, we have a slide deck of all the resources that we discussed throughout the affinity groups and throughout the blogs that came out of our community, or I'm sorry, out of the affinity groups resources.
Samantha, do you want to share your screen? I could stop sharing because that's a wonderful resource. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can share that wonderful resource you created.
Hold, please. Sorry.
Okay. So as Samantha gets your screen up, there's a tremendous number of resources that were created in collaboration with Cedar from what our stakeholders shared that attended, as well as what our presenters shared as they presented and facilitated these affinity groups. So
yeah, so this will be in our community. Hang on, let me slide show it. And it's just a wealth of resources from links to the different supports that Sean discussed, different articles that we brought up or that were brought up throughout the affinity groups, blogs that were talked about, basically anything and everything that came up from our affinity groups to answer the how do we prepare our pre-service teachers for the online environment. Yeah, different. It's a vast resource of the different breakout groups that we had, the different standards that Sean discussed, the IEP tip meetings that Sean just talked about, different podcasts that were recommended, and the recordings to the affinity group are also there, as well as some studies that were done in relation or prior to the affinity group that led to the affinity group, or led kind of like background from the affinity group, and different research articles that were brought up throughout our blog posts as well. And then resources that were provided in addition. And then it also links to the Cedar Center's website, which Keon showed earlier. And yeah, so that'll be in the community as a central place to reach it. So we look forward to having you there. And then if you can go ahead and reshare your screen.
oh, sure, I'd be happy to. Just
Sorry,
that's all right.
have way too
So
many.
here we go
windows
again.
open.
And I'll come back to that slide
Perfect.
we were sharing just a moment ago. There's that QR code to get to all those wonderful resources Samantha talked about. But
And then
I'm gonna move on here.
Mackenzie, also put it into the chat, the link directly.
Great.
Our next webinar is going to be on the application of UDL in teacher preparation programs, and that'll be with Dr. Stephanie Craig.
Stephanie is a teacher educator at Marietta College in Ohio and a leader in UDL implementation as a K-12 educator and now as a faculty member. So.
And her colleagues will also be presenting with her. And more information for that webinar and all of the upcoming blogs and our Siddle Sizzles, which are really great cooking competitions that integrate educational technology into cooking, as well as research and practice briefs with experts in the field. All of that information and our social media, you can visit that QR code and it'll take you and you'll get all of our information. And so you can stay up to date with Siddle. We'd love to have you as part of our conversation and just engaging with us.
So that's it for us today. We'd certainly be more than welcome to take any questions. We know people have been asking away in the chat, but if there are any more specific ones, feel free to chat away. Otherwise, as Samantha mentioned, we'll share these resources in a variety of different ways off our Siddle website, and hopefully there'll be things that you can apply. So Kian and Rachel, thank you so much for being here with us and being able to share your knowledge. And don't forget the Cedar Center folks and all the wonderful things the Cedar Center does. So.
And thank you so much to the Siddle Center for all